One crucial feature of postmodernism, which was not mentioned explicitly in Ihab Hassan's list, but against which we bumped a number of times in our discussions about the postmodern novel, from the floating opera to Flaubert's Parrot, is what I would call the anti-hermeneutic turn, or in other words, the tendency to go against interpretation. Already in the early 1956 postmodern novel, The Floating Opera by John Barth, life seems to resist interpretation. Life seems to hold anyone trying to make sense of it at a distance. When Todd Andrews casually describes life as a floating opera, a show on a boat traveling downriver in front of ever-changing audiences, indifferent audiences, which will not make much sense of the whole story because they can never get a full picture of it, then he is actually referring to life as an unapproachable mystery, as an unapproachable enigma. Todd is actually unable to understand his own impulses, his own emotions, when he's stuck in that shell hole with a German soldier during World War II, and he moves from hostility to acceptance, then to love, and then to hatred again. At the very end of this traumatic experience, he admits he was unable to understand what was going on in his mind. Ultimately, his own work, this very book, is an inquiry into the motivations of a gesture he was decided to make many years ago, and then he decided not to commit it: suicide. He doesn't understand now what were the reasons behind his decision to commit suicide, and then what were the reasons for deciding against it and deciding to leave. It's as if Todd Andrews cannot really know exactly what is going inside his mind, what are the mechanisms of his own decisions, of his own mind. His mind, for him, is like a black box, airtight, closed black box that he cannot break into. Similar doubts about our capacity to truly investigate and know the world are expressed by what William Spanos used to call the anti-detective fiction, like the fiction of American writer Paul Oster. In his New York trilogy, consisting of 3 novellas, City of Glass, Ghosts, and The Locked Room, Paul Oster plays with the idea of detection only to subvert it. There are quests, there are inquiries, there are dead ends. In one of the stories, a detective realizes that he had been watched all along himself, so who is the object of the inquiry? Who is being watched? By whom? In Ghost, you have a private eye called Blue who works for a client called White to investigate a man called Black who lives on Orange Street. And little by little, Blue gets immersed, lost completely in Black's life. In none of the stories is the detective successful. None of the stories have a conclusion. None have closure. Detective stories exist in order to produce a criminal. These stories fail to do so. There is no criminal at the end. Experimenting with detective fiction, declared Oster, was useful to me in the same way old musical hall routines and vaudevilles were useful in writing Waiting for Godot. Many novelists use crime fiction to write about other things. The issue that runs through all of these stories is ambiguity. Ambiguity and uncertainty. This is the essence of the New York trilogy. Somehow, we have to make room for the things we don't understand. We have to live with obscurity, says Paul Oster. And some other place he declares, we have to learn to live with ambiguity, or elsewhere, we have to accommodate the unknown. And then when a reporter asks him, does it mean we have to say goodbye to absolutes? Paul Oster replies, I believe so. Yes. Kurt Vonnegut's Bluebeard also orbits around a number of unknowns, of enigmas. The huge potato barn that elderly painter Rabo Karabekian still holds is a mystery to everyone, even to his friends, to his new wife. It might as well be Bluebeard's bloody chamber full of slaughtered wives. Flashbacks in the story reveal that Rabo Karabekian used to be an abstract expressionist painter, an avant-garde painter alongside famous names like Jackson Pollock or Willem de Kooning. These were painters who had turned their backs against representation, against figurative art. They were anti-mimetic and they didn't believe in representation. And when these painters insisted that people shouldn't try to decrypt their paintings, shouldn't try to look for figures or hidden meanings or symbols in their paintings, that also indicates they were against interpretation, or maybe against the excesses of interpretation that criticism made itself guilty of. Vonnegut's masterpiece, Slaughterhouse-Five, contemplates horror, like the horror of the bombing of Dresden, contemplates disappointment, like the failures of love and marriage, with an even eye that seems to have given up the idea of being able to make sense of all of these. When he speaks about the flaming horrors of the bombing of Dresden, one of the biggest catastrophes in World War II, one of the forgotten facts of history covered with amnesia, Billy Pilgrim can only say, so it goes. When people die, when he loses faith, when he loses sense of life, the only epitaph he has is, so it goes. And again, we might say that Billy Pilgrim, in his turn, rejects interpretation. It's not by accident it has been noted that Billy Pilgrim is an optometrist, someone whose job is to prepare glasses, spectacles for people who cannot see reality well. Maybe this is symbolic. It all makes sense when we learn about his experience with the Tralfamadorians, with him being abducted by aliens. And those aliens teach him an incredible lesson. The lesson is that there are more than 3 dimensions, and that time itself is a dimension that can be covered whichever way we wish. There is no past, there is no future, all moments coexist equally as a distinct dimension. Whether these experiences are true or hallucination, whether Billy Pilgrim had indeed visited an alien ship and traveled outside of our solar system, this remains unconcluded, and the author doesn't want to decide upon this. At the end of all of these adventures, there is only one thing we could say: so it goes. Other doubts, the doubts about our very possibility of knowing reality through documents, of knowing past through documents, makes the very substance of Julian Barnes' wonderful novel Flaubert's Parrot. There, a biographer, and the biographer is nothing short of a historian of a person, has his doubts. History is an autobiography disguised as parliamentary report, he exclaims at some point, a paradoxical sentence which betrays his exasperation, his frustration with the way the past is elusive, the past escapes us, and its markers, its testimonials, its documents are forever lying, are forever deceiving. No matter how long we pore over documents, we'll never know for sure whether Flaubert was tall or not so tall, was fat or not so fat, whether Emma Bovary's eyes were blue or gray or black. We will never know for sure what was the real color of that red currant sunset. And the final blow in the novel is when Geoffrey Braithwaite, the biographer, who had been in search of the famed stuffed Parrot that had witnessed the composition of Un Coeur Simple, a wonderful novella by Flaubert, ends up by finding not one parrot, but a whole collection of stuffed parrots, identical replicas. And which of them is the real? Which of them is assigned to the past? We don't know. From all of these, we can see that there is a constant trend of rejection of interpretation, of rejection of excessive meaning in postmodern fiction. And it would be interesting to go back now to Ihab Hassan and see whether he mentioned any of that. In fact, I checked and only found maybe 3 possible moments when he gets close to this anti-hermeneutic turn, yet without naming it. The first one would be depthlessness. Depthlessness would obviously refer to characters that are flat, to stories that are monodimensional. This seems to be a reaction to the excess of psychological analysis that you found in the previous fiction, in modernist fiction. It was a reaction against the Freudian submerged iceberg, which was always present, a reaction against the Jungian animus and anima and shadow, and all of those mythical parallels that were created on the basis of the idea of archetype and collective subconscious. And now, apparently, the postmoderns have had enough of that, and now they turn to the simple, primitive craft of creating monodimensional characters. We should understand that many of these are created in a polemic way. A lot of the characters in Vonnegut, for instance those from his science fiction novel Galapagos, are like that. They are just names with one feature, one character. They begin to look very much like, slapstick comedy people like Stanley and Laurel or Harold Lloyd, comical actors of the silent era, or maybe they look very much like characters from comics. Lack of depth translates easily as lack of self. So selflessness would be another characteristic that might have some contingency with our anti-hermeneutic turn. I would, however, suggest that these 2 features in Ihab Hassan, selflessness and depthlessness, are rather limited. They can only be found in a few novels, a few short stories at the very beginning of postmodernism, the more radical stories, the more experimental ones, those that were sometimes called schismatic postmodernism. The third feature in Hassan, immanence, might offer more ground, more traction. Look at immanence at the opposite of transcendence. And as Hassan has it, this is that characteristic of postmodernism, giving up on any higher authority, any grand narrative, any divinity, any grand philosophy. All of these are relinquished, all of these seem to be abandoned at the expense of a live in the moment philosophy, at the expense of a painful awareness that there is very little beyond this world of the senses, this material world. This feature will be better understood the moment we move to the next author, the author that actually spoke openly for the first time about this anti-hermeneutic turn. Susan Sontag, an iconic figure of the last third of the previous century, a filmmaker, a philosopher, a writer, a political activist, a feminist, wrote an interesting essay in 1966. It is called Against Interpretation. Sontag invites us first to look at what interpretation is and where it originated from. And she says, in art, interpretation means plucking a set of elements, the X, the Y, the Z, and so forth, from the whole work. The task of interpretation is virtually one of translation. The interpreter says, look, don't you see that X is really A? Or that Y is really B? Or that Z is really C? She goes on to indicate where this obsession with interpretation originated in the interpretations of the Bible. Because some people used to interpret the Bible in a literal way. They were theologians, they were specialists, scholars that had a task to explain, to decode the meanings, to look at the symbols and the parables and put them in straight language. little by little, this task had been taken over by interpreters of other texts, interpreters of poems, interpreters of plays, of literature. And little by little, these people gained more power. And they tended to impose their truths, the truth of their interpretation, as an absolute one. This, in Susan Sontag's eyes, is not a good thing. And she says, in some cultural contexts, interpretation might be a liberating act. It might be a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. But, she warns, in other cultural contexts, it is reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling. And then she goes on to say, this is such a time when the project of interpretation is largely reactionary, stifling, like the fumes of the automobile and the heavy industry which befoul the urban atmosphere. The fusion of interpretations of today art poisons our sensibilities. In a culture whose already classical dilemma is a hypertrophy of the intellect at the expense of energy and sensual capability, interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. But then Susan Sontag goes even further. She writes, in most modern instances, interpretation amounts to the Philistine refusal to leave the work of art alone. Real art has a capacity to make us nervous. By reducing the work of art to its content and then interpreting that, one tames, domesticates the work of art. Interpretation makes art manageable, comfortable. And then she notes that this Philistinism of interpretation is more rife in literature than in any other art. Every modernist author, Proust, Joyce, Faulkner, Rilke, Lawrence, Gide, one after the other, they have been subjected to the same avalanche of interpretation. Some say interpretation is the compliment that mediocrity pays to genius. The after-war literature had tried to repel, to reject this avalanche of interpretation. How? By multiplying meanings, then by promoting ambiguity, double entendre, dual meaning. This was the artist's way of reacting against the excesses of interpretation. And Sontag notes that, I quote, interpretation of this type, excessive interpretation, indicates a dissatisfaction, whether conscious or unconscious, with a work, a wish to replace it with something else. Interpretation based on the highly dubious theory that a work of art is composed of items, of content, this type of interpretation violates art. Flight from interpretation happens especially in modern painting, and Susan Sontag mentions abstract painting. Then she also identifies this in poetry such as symbolism, the poetry in which the music, the magic of the sounds and of the words replaces meaning. At some point, Sontag draws a parallel between the work of the archaeologist and that of the critic, of the interpreter. Archaeologists need to reach a deeply hidden treasure someplace, an artifact. So they know they have to destroy the surface, to take layer after layer of earth and then reach that artifact. But that's where this analogy must stop. Because a work of art does not consist of surface and core, of form and content, as many poor teachers of literature still tell you. These two should not be distinguished, cannot be distinguished, and shouldn't be distinguished. How should art defend itself from such violation? One of the solutions, Sontag says, is the work of art should become more transparent. If the work of art is transparent enough, then critics would be repelled by the lack of layers. As she says, once upon a time it must have been a revolutionary and creative move to design works of art so that they might be experienced on several levels. Now it is not. This reinforces the principle of redundancy, of repetition. That is the principal affliction of modern life. And the solution to that comes from a very unusual angle. Sontag suggests that the work of art should become more sensory, more sensual. And because then the work of art is gonna produce something that interpretation, that the critics are highly uncomfortable with, sensory experience. The final lines of Susan Sontag's essay sound like a manifesto, and I'm gonna read them all. What is important now, she says, is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. Our task is not to find the maximum comfort of content in a work of art, much less to squeeze more content out of the work that is already there. Our task is to cut back content so that we can see the thing at all. The aim of all commentary on art now should be to make works of art, and by analogy our own experience, more rather than less real to us. And the last section of Susan Sontag's essay, Against Interpretation, has only one line. It runs like this. In place of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art.